Oh shit, I'll be late again. This thought flashed through my head as I turned the last corner leading to my house. It was 3:25 and my wife, Helen, told me to be home no later than 3 o'clock. Her sister Tammy and her husband were coming over for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, and they were going to bring their almost 90-year-old mother, Helen, with them. Our daughter, Megan, and her husband, Nick, were also coming, and they were bringing my grandson, Bobby, with them. I glanced at the contents of the thick manila folder next to me. In the last month, I've spent almost $6,000 on virtually nothing. There was nothing in all the photographs. All the incident reports said nothing either, but my gut told me that something was going on. Call it psychic abilities, male intuition, or destiny, but something is wrong in my marriage. My name is Hiram Walker. My mother named me after some old man who gave her a job before she got married, and she promised to name her first son after him. I'm 54 years old, but I keep myself in very good shape. I am a physician and have a small family private practice, but I also work at a local hospital. Maybe this is part of the problem in my marriage. The number of hours I work is not conducive to our relationship, but in my profession, it is very important to be available to patients. Another thing is that I love my job. I love helping people and making them feel better when they are sick or injured. My wife Helen is a completely different person. We met and fell in love almost 25 years ago. I worked in a clinic that later became my private practice. She was a real estate agent and helped me get financing to buy the building that housed the clinic. She was several years older than me, but then she was a real beauty. Of course, after the wedding, she neglected herself a little, but I love her much more now than then. Our shared past and all the years we spent together brought me closer to her than to my mother. But lately something has gone wrong. Why should I care, you ask? Helen will soon be 60. I think the reason is because, as I said, I love her. And I love her a little more every day. There's nothing I wouldn't do for Helen. It's like being a professional baseball player. You can choose any glove. There are many companies that offer you money to use their gloves, but you still love the glove you've been using since the beginning of the game. Helen was my glove. As I drove down the ramp leading into my home's underground garage, the sound of the Mustang's mighty 8-cylinder engine lifted my spirits a little. No matter where I was or what I was doing, that sound resonated in my soul, reminding me of happier times. It took me back to those days before oil embargoes and $3 gas, when I had no worries or problems. When I got out of the car and pressed the alarm button on the key fob, I saw Kelly Callum. She was also getting out of her car. Kelly worked at the same hospital as me as a pharmaceutical technician. In fact, I recommended her for the job and helped her with some college classes. She ran up to me, and I stopped to wait for her. "Hello, hi," she smiled. It was our inside joke. Kelly was the only person who called me Hi, her version of a nickname for Hiram. "So what do you think?" she asked, waiting for my opinion on something. "Sorry, Kelly," I said. "I don't quite understand what you're asking." "About my Mustang," she said, looking offended. "I mean, it's not a Shelby GT500, but it's the exact same color as yours," she said. "I even have the same wheels and the same interior," she smiled again. "That's great, Kelly," I said, sounding more enthusiastic than I actually felt. I wondered why Kelly, at 32, was still trying to impress me as if she was still that 18-year-old girl who moved into the house all those years ago. "What's wrong with you that you don't want to talk about Mustangs?" she asked, looking at me suspiciously. I didn't say anything. I just pursed my lips and pressed the elevator button to her floor and mine. "Hiram, is there something going on that I should know about?" she asked. "No, Kelly, it's okay. Maybe it's just old age catching up with me," I said. Kelly started laughing as soon as I said that. "You are not old yet," she said. "In fact, you are practically perfect. If you need anything or just need someone to talk to, I'm always here for you," she said, walking out of the elevator and leaving me alone with my thoughts. Our apartment occupied the entire southern edge of the building on the top floor. Since these were originally several apartments that we combined, we had more than one entrance. I really didn't want to walk through the front door and be confronted by Helen and family and lots of questions about where I was and why I was late. I decided to sneak through the back door near the kitchen and quietly enter the celebration. I really thought Helen and everyone else would already be sitting at the table eating. But I think all the years we spent together taught Helen something about me. It turned out that she told me to come home an hour earlier than the others, so even though I was half an hour late, I was actually early. I opened the door carefully. I wasn't trying to spy on anyone. I swear I was just trying to sneak into my house when I saw them. My brother-in-law, Ted, walked into my kitchen like he owned it. He grabbed Helen as if she belonged to him too. Helen turned around like a scalded cat, ready to strike him, until she saw who it was. Then she turned back to what she was doing. I watched my wife cling to him. I took out my iPhone and recorded a few seconds of video, took a few pictures, then turned around and walked back. I walked in through the front door, and after saying hello to all our friends and family, I went into the office to think. My name is Helen Walker. I made a terrible mistake that cost me my happiness, my marriage, and the love of someone who would love me forever. A few months ago, we had a family holiday, and my sister's husband, Ted, a very good man, worked with me in the kitchen. My husband, Hiram, who I absolutely love, was outside grilling on our balcony. My sister Tammy was lying in the guest room because she had a headache. Tammy always has a headache. I think a lot of it is because she's lazy and just doesn't want to do anything. While Ted and I were chopping onions and making sauce, we were in a very tight space, and his hand accidentally touched my butt as he was reaching for the bowl. It had been a long time since someone had tried to grope me, but when I was younger, I had to really fight to keep guys away. "Sorry," Ted said. "It was an accident." "It's a pity," I replied. Ted and I looked at each other, and time stood still. He hesitantly pulled me towards him, and we kissed. It was different than when Hiram kissed me. It wasn't better or worse, just different. In some ways, I liked the way my husband kissed me better. But for the past few years, Hiram's kisses have been very routine, as usual. I remember when Hiram's passion could ignite me. Ted, on the other hand, gave the impression of desperate need with his kisses. It was as if he needed me so much that he couldn't live without me, and I loved that feeling. "Wait," he said, "we shouldn't do this." When I caught my breath, I nodded in agreement. After all, his wife was my sister, and I was glad that he had the sense to stop because I wasn't sure that I could do it. I think at this point in my life, I needed something. I felt my youth and vitality draining away from me, and perhaps I was just looking for one last chance to feel like a young and carefree woman before truly becoming the old woman people see me as. Hiram has been running and working out, so he hasn't aged as quickly as I have, and he's also 8 years younger than me. He could easily look 40, and society perceives aging differently between men and women. An older man is a person with experience, an older woman is simply old. You see a lot of couples where the older man ends up with some young hot chick, but there are very few cases where the older woman ends up with the younger guy. So maybe I just wanted an innocent fling before I was completely labeled a grandma. Ted wasn't going to do it anyway because he stubbornly refused to do anything other than the occasional kiss or play of pinch hitting during a family event. By Thanksgiving time, I had completely forgotten about my seemingly innocent crush on Ted when he walked into the kitchen and grabbed me. This was a big surprise for me. I reacted to his initial touch by turning my head sharply to see who it was, and when I realized it was Ted, I just relaxed and let him. It wasn't anything serious. Besides, Hiram wasn't home yet, and among my lazy relatives, hardly anyone would suggest doing anything other than eat and leave. After Ted left the kitchen, I heard the front door open and close and realized it was Hiram, almost an hour later, as I expected. But in fact, he was a little earlier. All the years of living and loving with this man had made him predictable. I knew that he would say hello to everyone and then go straight to the kitchen to apologize for being late. The thing is, he will really regret being late because he loves me so much, but he can't control it. As much as he loves me, he loves being a doctor and caring for his patients just as much, So if he had to choose between being on time for dinner or spending a few minutes consoling someone who is getting ready for surgery or has just found out they have cancer, let's just say there have been enough overcooked roast beef over the years to give me a clue as to what to say. Hello. Don't get me wrong, I love Hiram with all my heart and intend to spend the rest of my life with him. But lately, I just needed something to feel alive. My gut told me something was wrong when Hiram didn't show up in the kitchen a few minutes later. I walked out into the living room to see what was holding him up and saw a crowd of my family gathered around the 50-inch plasma, eager for HD. They were watching the same stupid holiday program that we always watch, but they oohed and awed as if the show was different because of the high definition. I looked around and didn't see my husband, but I was sure he was here. Ted gestured toward the office, and I nodded my thanks before he immersed himself in the delights of the big screen again. I knocked carefully and heard Hiram tell me to enter. From his voice, I realized that something was wrong. He wiped his face before turning to me, but he couldn't do it fast enough. He seemed to be crying. "Hiram, what happened?" I asked, really worried because in all the years we've been together, I've never seen Hiram lose his temper. For no reason at all, he was always the one who supported others, including me, through tragedy and helped us see that the pain was temporary and that things would get better. "Nothing," he said, trying to sound cheerful but failing. "I think I lost one of them today, that's all." "What do you mean you think you've lost one?" I asked. It didn't make sense. Either someone died or they didn't. Something was wrong here. Hiram had always been the most honest man I knew, but it seemed like he was trying to hide something from me, his wife. "Who do you think you've lost?" I asked, taking his hands in mine. Hiram was trembling. I really had a feeling that this was something much more personal than he was saying, but I didn't insist. Hiram would tell me when he was ready. "I think I lost Helen," he said. "She was still there when I left the hospital. I think even then it could have been over. But now I'm almost sure that it's no longer possible to save it after what I saw." He said some meaningless things. Apparently one of his patients, a woman named Helen. She must have had some terrible disease and was on the verge of death. Hiram was so involved in the lives of these people that it was always a personal tragedy for him when one of them did not survive. He probably saw her test results before leaving the hospital and knew she wouldn't last long. In his mind, he probably should have stayed in the hospital to be with her so she wouldn't die alone, but out of a desire to please me, he came home. If I had not known before that Hiram loved me, now I was sure of it. This man sat here in grief, but he put my wishes before his patience. It made me feel even worse about what I was doing. I'll have to stop this before he finds out. It was like a bad omen or warning. The woman he lost was named Helen, like me. Of course, I later found out that there was no patient named Helen. He warned me all the time. "Goodbye." I heard Helen calling me to the table and slowly stood up. Even though I felt terrible, I had to keep up appearances. There was no reason to let my problems ruin everyone else's holiday. That would be extremely selfish. So I walked to the door and turned the knob. Every step made me more focused. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, and when I looked in the mirror, I tried to make everything look normal. Maybe I looked a little tired, but that's easy to explain. As I sat down at the table, I forced myself to smile and looked around the room. Here they are, family. Only one of these parasites was actually related to me by blood. They were all Helen's family. Her mother is a good woman, although at her age she will not live long. Helen's sister Tammy truly was a good woman, but deep down I wondered, doesn't she deserve to know what's going on? If I don't say anything, doesn't that make me complicit in deceiving our spouses? Our daughter, Megan, maybe it's my fault, all those years of overwork, that we're not as close. Maybe that's why I felt more like Kelly was my daughter than Megan. Megan's husband, Nick, was a nice guy. If only he could find a job, any job, better than just sitting at home and wearing out the damn couch. He couldn't even take care of the baby while Megan was working. I had to pay for daycare because, with Megan alone paying all their bills, they simply couldn't afford it. My grandson Bobby, Robert Hiram Marks, named after Nick's father and me. I guess they didn't want to alienate any potential sources of additional income. I wasn't even mad that I got a minor mention, but major bills. I looked down and noticed that I was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that it was shaking. I also rarely used curse words, even in my thoughts. I only had to hold out for a few hours, but it was harder than I thought. I relaxed my arms and looked at Helen, who was staring at me. Maybe she sensed my anger, or maybe she was just wondering what was wrong with me. She was probably wondering if I knew. No, I didn't guess. Helen was firmly convinced of her superiority over other people. In her head, she was smarter, faster, and more beautiful than any other creature God had made. No one could ever understand what she was doing. She was much smarter than the average bear. Well, damn you, bitch. I know, and I won't let you get away with it. Once we get rid of these damn parasites, you and I will talk, and this will determine our future. I looked at Ted, my brother-in-law. We weren't close, but I always thought we respected each other. It seems I was as wrong about this as about everything else. He was a smug bastard, from the arrogant smile on his face to the way he gently took Tammy's hand. No one would ever have guessed that this bastard was sleeping with my wife. I needed to control myself. My rage was growing, and the people at the table, with the exception of my mother-in-law, who was so overwhelmed with her medications that she could barely function, and the child probably noticed. Maybe that's why it was difficult for them to meet my gaze. Then I looked at the worst one. Helen, my supposed soulmate. My wife for all these many years. I remember when we met, all my friends were against me dating her, let alone marrying her. They were all sure that she was too old for me. They were also sure that this was more a marriage of convenience than love. After all, the real estate market in our area was drying up, and they assured me that she just wanted some of the money and lifestyle that the phrase, "I'm married to a doctor," brings. The fact that Helen decided to retire a few weeks after our engagement did nothing to dissuade them of the validity of their theories. Helen smiled nervously at me and tried to diffuse the obvious tension in the room. I tried to make my face more friendly when she started talking. I think my husband is too worried about his patients to really do his duty as a host right now, Helen began. So, Ted, why don't you say a prayer? The bitch didn't know that this was literally the last straw. So here's her theory. I'm too busy working to support her and her damn parasites to fulfill my duties as a master and secretly as a husband. So she just found Ted to fill my spot. As a master and as a husband. Before Helen started to open her mouth, I was upset, maybe a little mad, but that could be explained. But her subtle speech, understandable only to those who knew what was happening, triggered the end of events. Ted stood up and tapped his damn fork on one of those damn crystal glasses I bought for crazy money. Then he smiled and looked around the table. I just couldn't believe the audacity of this bastard. Did he think he was on damn TV? He probably already knew that Helen would ask him to say a prayer this year. This will probably be the last year I'm here. She probably wanted a divorce so she could be with Ted. What about your own damn wife, you sneaky bastard? Ted talked about how grateful he was to have the whole family back together, and that it didn't happen as often as he would like. He then went on to say that families must share what they have to move society forward. I could totally understand why he was talking about this. He was sharing my damn wife, wasn't he? I just sat there, lost in my thoughts, until I realized that everyone was eating and passing dishes around the table. I also suddenly realized that someone was talking to me. Hiram, do you want me to cut up the turkey? Ted asked, probably for the third time. You'd probably want that, wouldn't you? I spat. Well, yes, brother-in-law, Ted smiled. I may be alone, but I can't wait to put a knife in that turkey. For a man my age, lifting a 45-pound turkey is no big deal if you're as fit as I am. But throwing it across the long dining table into the smug face of your tormentor is another matter. Ted's smile disappeared as the turkey, stuffing and all, slammed into his face. Since he was already leaning back in his chair, the weight of the turkey coupled with its speed was enough to overwhelm him and send him crashing to the floor. I quickly stood up, grabbed a bowl of mashed potatoes, and dumped the entire bowl on Ted's face. Then I poured a bowl of gravy over it. "Is that enough, Ted? Go ahead, enjoy yourself," I shouted. I snatched the bowl of sweetened sweet potatoes with lemon sauce from Helen's surprised hands. "Thanks, bitch," I snapped. Then he poured them onto the gasping Ted. "Your diet should be balanced, bastard," I snapped. "Here's some green beans for you." "Hiram, what's happening to you?" Tammy screamed. She finally came to her senses and rushed to her husband, standing between me and Ted to prevent me from doing anything else. I didn't answer. I just took out my iPhone and walked over to the big screen TV that everyone was just watching. Connecting it to the TV, I played a video that I had shot recently. On the screen, everyone saw Ted grabbing Helen, with the exception, again, of my mother-in-law, who continued to eat without noticing what was happening. Everyone looked at Ted, then at Helen. "No, Hiram, it's not what you think," said Helen. "Then what is it?" Tammy asked, her voice choked with anger. Neither Helen nor Ted knew what to say. "Nothing to say, huh, Helen?" I snapped. "I'll go for a while. When I get back, you and Ted should have a story for me." "Where are you going?" she asked, with tears in her eyes. "Get yourself a good divorce lawyer," I snapped. I don't know why I said that. Maybe I was just trying to hurt her the same way she hurt me. At that moment, I just really wanted to know why she was doing this. In my mind, it had to be because I'm not doing something, or maybe I'm doing something that she can't stand. I just wanted to know what I needed to do to save our marriage. I ran out of the apartment and Helen ran after me down the hallway, screaming and crying. Knowing that she wouldn't be able to go down the stairs fast enough to catch me, I took the stairs instead of the elevator. When I reached the third floor, there was a group of guys blocking the stairs. "Can I come in, guys?" I asked them angrily. I recognized several of them. They all grew up in this house, and I took care of them when they were sick. A couple of them were still my patients. Most of them easily parted, and one or two even greeted me. But there were a couple of people, including Tom Finn and Henry Bennett, who looked at me with a mixture of menace and ridicule. It seemed like they were both angry at me and laughing at me. They cleared the road more slowly. I wondered what was wrong with them, but the early 20s are full of problems, so I just shelved them, going down 4 more floors. 3 more floors brought me to the ground level, and the last floor brought me to the garage. The design engineers at Ford must have worked with a team of psychologists. Otherwise, I can't explain why I smile every time I see this car. Just as I approached her, intending to just ride until I felt better, a hand on my shoulder scared the living daylights out of me, almost literally. "Today is Thanksgiving. Where are you going?" Kelly laughed. "Nowhere, just for a ride," I said, trying to keep the tone of my voice free of anger. "So what is it? Going nowhere or going for a ride? You can't go anywhere, then you'll stay here. If you're going for a ride, that means you're going somewhere, even if you don't know where exactly." "Kelly, please, I'm not in the mood for riddles right now," I said. She looked at me, and after a few seconds, she took my keys from my outstretched hand. She opened the driver's door and sat down. She then closed the door and inserted the keys into the ignition. She rolled down the window and asked, "Are you going or not?" "Shouldn't you be somewhere for Thanksgiving?" I asked. "Visiting family or some young man?" "Hiram, you're part of my family," she said, sincerely. "The rest of my family makes me nervous. They're mostly freeloaders. So I usually stay at home and do things that I don't have time for because of work." We drove for several minutes in silence, slowly weaving through residential streets. Kelly was an excellent driver. She stopped at every sign and traffic light. She also knew how to handle the car's tight clutch and fast acceleration almost as well as I could, and I'd been driving it for a couple of years now. But once we hit the freeway, it was a different matter. I felt the seat cushions pushing me forward with a force I had never felt while driving a car myself. Kelly's face was a mask of delight. Smile chained the look on her lips as she shifted gears would be worth a speeding ticket, or even a trip to jail if the cops were around. Hearing the Mustang's roar, amplified by the squeal of the supercharger, was a new pleasure for me. I've never driven a car so fast. "I definitely need one like this," Kelly exclaimed. "What movie is this from?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the road. "I don't know," I said indifferently. I was suffering from two problems at the same time. First of all, I just discovered that my wife is cheating on me with my brother-in-law. Secondly, I thought about how I could maintain my masculinity if I told a girl young enough to be my daughter that she drives so fast that it scares me. I glanced furtively at the speedometer. Kelly was driving at 130 miles per hour, and the speed continued to increase. I looked at the tachometer, and it was far from the red zone. Damn, how fast can this damn car go? To make matters worse, the boost gauge needle was barely moving, meaning we could be going a lot faster. That was the line Will Smith said in Independence Day when he first got behind the wheel of an alien ship. "You took me to see that movie when I was in college," she said, smiling. Between gear changes, Kelly's left hand gently touched mine. The fact that she was so calm relaxed me too. I realized that if she killed us, if we just crashed into something and died now, at least I wouldn't have to go back and face Helen. Just as I had this great revelation, Kelly shifted down a gear and slowed down just in time to turn onto another section of the freeway. She slowed down to a modest 80 miles per hour and looked at me. "What did she do?" she asked without looking at me. The tone of her question made me wonder how the hell she knew, but she clearly knew something was going on with Helen and me. "Who did what?" I answered. "Helen, your supposed wife, Hiram," she said seriously. "For it to upset you like that, it has to be something to do with Helen. You can tell me, because you clearly need to get it out. I also won't slow down or bring you back until you feel better, so get it out." She said, "I'm not really comfortable talking about this with you, Kelly. You're like my daughter," I said. "Now we're starting to get somewhere," she said. "That says two things. One, that it's obviously related to sex. And two, if you're treating me like a daughter, I'm taking the wrong approach. Hiram, I'm 32 years old, so although you've known me since you were a child, I'm not the little girl you helped with her homework anymore. I've been in a few relationships, and I've even had sex a couple of times. Plus, I'm a medical professional, like you. So nothing you say will shock me," she said. "Let me guess, you finally realized that Helen isn't right for you. She's just too old, and she's not interested in sex anymore. I don't think she needs hormone therapy, Hiram. I think she needs a nursing home. Even when I was a kid, I knew you were destined to go your separate ways eventually," she said. "I guess," she asked. "I told you I wouldn't be shocked." "Helen is cheating on me with my brother-in-law," I said bluntly. "Shut the hell up," Kelly exclaimed, turning to me. "Okay, I'm shocked," she said. "What nerve does this bitch have? The first thing we need to do is find a good divorce lawyer." Kelly continued talking, making plans and coming up with options. She kept saying that we needed to do this and that we shouldn't let her do that. It almost seemed like Kelly was glad my marriage was falling apart. I remembered how she lived with Helen and me when her own parents separated. Fortunately, they were able to save their marriage over time and a lot of therapy. In their case, he changed. But it probably doesn't matter which one is to blame. The main question is always the same. Can this marriage be saved? To be honest, until that moment I had never even thought about life without Helen. Even when I flew out of the apartment, I knew that I would return. I just needed time to process the information. Then I was determined to talk about what we needed to do to make things right. I knew we would need counseling, and I would insist that Ted never set foot in my home again and that we never see him again. Will Tammy divorce this bastard? If so, that would greatly simplify matters. But being a realist, I assumed that it was her decision about how to deal with infidelity in her marriage, just as it was my decision about what to do with Helen. "Where are you going to stay while you figure this out?" Kelly asked, bringing me out of my thoughts. "I think I'll just sleep in the guest room," I said, starting to think about this in more than just temporary terms. "Why do you have to move into the guest room?" Kelly asked. "It's not your fault here. Let her move into the damn guest room. Are you sure you even want to stay in the same house as her? You can use my guest room if you want." "Really," Kelly continued, "I just don't understand why you would ever go back to that apartment with her. There's no discussion or negotiation involved. We just need to get a lawyer and free you from that bitch so you can move on with your life. With your life. I nodded as if I agreed with Kelly, but in reality, I was still thinking about staying out of the house long enough to calm down and then coming back to run into Helen and talk about our future, or whether there is one at all. As for finding a lawyer, I realized that this would not be necessary. I already had a great attorney on retainer. He could easily handle my divorce if it came to that, just like he handles medical malpractice cases, billing disputes, and everything else. I also needed to update information for the private investigator I hired. They clearly needed to change their approach. They stood guard around the building, waiting for Helen to come out, but it was obvious that she was carrying out her affair inside our house. I needed to equip the apartment and building with surveillance equipment. I was sure that Helen would probably not immediately break up with Ted. They seemed very familiar with each other, and that kind of comfort only comes with a long relationship. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Maybe you should have an affair too, Kelly stated, with someone younger and better suited for you. Then you'll really show that bitch what she's lost. Helen, Tammy, and Ted were sitting at the table when I returned to the apartment. Helen jumped up and ran towards me as soon as I opened the door. Hiram, I'm so sorry, she began, but it's not what you think. She was obviously crying and looked terrible. Tammy didn't look much better. Even Ted looked like a beaten dog. Of the three, he seemed the most remorseful, which was strange. I walked past Helen and headed into the bedroom without saying a word. Helen opened the door that I had forgotten to lock and kept trying to talk to me. Hiram, can we talk about this? She asked. Okay, Helen, speak up, I said as coldly as possible. Can we go back to the dining room? She asked. I followed her slowly into the dining room, where Tammy and Ted. Helen sat noticeably further away from Tammy and Ted. Tammy clearly wasn't sitting close to either Ted. I remained standing in the doorway. Helen tried to indicate to me that I should sit next to her by pulling out the chair next to me. I shook my head and remained standing. It would be easier to talk if you sat down, Hiram, said Helen. I don't know how long it takes you to say what you want, but I don't plan on spending all night here, I snapped. I have patients in the morning, and I have no reason to cancel my appointment. Hiram, Ted and I have never had sex. Not once. What you saw today, how bad it was all that ever happened between us. Just two confused people struggling with their age and mortality, letting innocent flirting go too far, she said. Ted nodded his head as quickly as he could, agreeing with her. My hormones are all mixed up, Hiram. I'm also trying to cope with the fact that I'm slowly, maybe not so slowly, turning from that hot woman you married 20-odd years ago into an old grandma, Helen said. From the first moment we met, you have always been the only man I love, and I want us to grow old together, she continued. But sometimes it feels like I'm growing old alone. You don't look as old as I do, even though you're only a few years younger. You drive your Mustang and go jogging, and I'm left here alone. A lot of times when we go out together, people look at me like I'm your mother or something, and I think it drives me crazy. But I swear to you that there was never sex between me and Ted, she said. I know it went on for a while, but it was just quick kisses or light touches during family gatherings. The secrecy made it more exciting than it actually was, she said, trying to hold back tears. We can't work this out. It was nothing. Why would you want to throw away 20-odd years for one mistake? She asked. Tammy and Ted have already decided they're going to stay together, and they have as many reasons for breaking up as we do, and they've been together for less time. If their marriage is worth trying to save, isn't ours worth it? She cried. I will do anything to make it up to you. Please don't divorce me. Her voice trembled, and she didn't even try to hide her tears. Helen slid down from her chair and was literally on her knees, looking at me. I'll think about it, I said, and went back to the bedroom. After a while, I was lying in bed watching TV when Helen quietly entered the room. She was getting ready for bed in the other bathroom and put on a silk nightie that she knew was my favorite. She looked at the TV screen, hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the edge of the bed. Helen, we're not sleeping together, and I'm already here, so you can choose either Megan's room or the guest room, I snapped. Hiram, I'm not expecting sex, I was just thinking, she began. Well, don't think so, I said. We won't be sleeping in the same room, and I'm not even sure we'll be in the same house. Originally, I thought you were supposed to go with Tammy and Ted, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I don't even know how I feel about this. I'm just reacting now. When I have time to think about it, one of us may still have to leave, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. But for now, Helen, I just don't want to be around you. Helen left the room and apparently went to the guest room right next door. At night, my thoughts did not let me sleep. I would fall asleep, only to wake up shortly after. Several times during the night, I heard Helen quietly crying, but this did not help change my mind or make me feel better. The next morning, I was up and out for a run long before Helen woke up. When I returned to the apartment, I heard Helen start to move. I quickly showered and got dressed because I didn't want to see her. When I came out of the bathroom, Helen was placing a cup of my favorite coffee and a pastry on my seat at the table. As I headed towards the door, I heard her voice. Would you like to eat something? You always tell your patients to eat something after exercise, she said quietly. I looked at her as if she was crazy, but I tried to keep control of my voice, although not very successfully. Helen, a cup of damn coffee and a sweet bun won't make up for what you did, so just have a nice day. Don't worry about me, just like you didn't worry about me the last few months while you were sleeping with Ted, I said and walked out the door. Helen was stunned when she saw Hiram walk out the door. Just like yesterday, when all her efforts to prepare for the Thanksgiving holiday were ruined, she sank to the floor and began to cry. If she had hoped for a quick resolution to the situation, she now realized that this would not happen. This will be very bad, much worse than she expected. Hiram must know that she loves him more than anyone in the world. He was her life, more important to her than friends, family, and even their daughter. He should know this. Flirting with Ted was nothing, so minor that she even forgot about it. She had been feeling old and unattractive lately. Her greatest wish was to grow old with Hiram, but he seemed getting younger every year relative to it. When they first met, most of her friends thought he was too boring for her, but she fell in love with him immediately. He exercised regularly, and although he was only a few years younger, it seemed that the age gap was much greater than it actually was. She had always dreamed that they would grow old together, and it seemed to her that she was growing old alone while Hiram grew younger. She also noticed that young nurses and hospital workers paid a lot of attention to her husband. She wanted him to pay as much attention to her as in the early years of their marriage. Until yesterday, when she saw how hurt he was over Ted, she didn't realize that he still loved her as much as before. Helen truly believed that her hormonal levels were the cause of her problems. Lately, she wanted sex more than ever. Hiram never let her down, and even at their age, they had an active sex life, but it wasn't enough. She thought Hiram must have noticed that she hadn't been as assertive as usual these past few weeks. This may have made him suspect that she was cheating with Ted. In fact, she was telling the truth. She never had sex with Ted. But in recent weeks, she had been too tired to have sex with Hiram and thought it was not a good idea to show him her naked body. The thought that she could ruin her marriage made her feel sick. She felt really bad. She got up and headed to the bathroom as quickly as possible, but didn't have time and had to vomit into the sink instead of the toilet. She wiped her face, brushed her teeth, and decided to lie down for a while until the nausea passed. She had the same feeling yesterday, but that was before it all started, so maybe it will pass. Hiram was at his desk much earlier than usual. He had a few receptions planned for that day due to the holiday, but he had things to do. He called his lawyer and explained the situation with Helen, asking for a copy of their prenuptial agreement. In fact, the nearly 25-year-old document was originally drawn up to protect Helen's assets. She was the one with a large real estate income, while he was an aspiring young doctor with thousands of dollars in student debt and no place to practice. The document stated that in the event of a divorce, Each of them retains his property and cannot receive more than 20% of the value of the spouse's assets. Hiram was valued at about $1 million, so Helen would get no more than $200,000 now, and that wouldn't last long. Of course, Hiram had other money hidden away, but Helen was never interested in its actual net worth, only that she could buy what she wanted. She'll be fine, but if she doesn't go back to work, her standard of living will drop significantly. And who will hire her at 60? His second call was to a private detective agency. He needed to increase the level of surveillance of Helen. Prior to this, he had intended to go to counseling to try to resolve the problem. He loved Helen deeply and could not imagine life without her. At the same time, he was not a fool. If Helen contacts Ted again, Ted may take her away. He almost believed some of what she had said yesterday about her hormones being out of whack and her feeling old and unattractive. She probably also suffered from depression due to aging and just plain boredom. She rarely left the house, except for shopping and occasional dinners with Hiram. He was going to insist that she volunteer at the hospital, helping elderly patients and very young patients. Working with older, sick people would help her feel more attractive and realize that she still has a lot of good things in her. Working with younger patients would give her more energy and drive. All Helen needs is a purpose in life and a little outside contact, and perhaps she can once again become the woman Hiram loved. On the other hand, their marriage will require a lot of work to survive after this. Right now, he was leaning toward one of them moving out for a while, maybe even a legal separation, because every time he saw her, his anger only grew. Anger will not help them resolve the situation. It will likely only drive them further apart. Last night was the first time since they got married that they slept separately. This will probably get worse before it gets better. Kelly also called Hiram to see how he was feeling and offered him lunch. He told her he didn't really want to go out, he just wanted to work. Michael Collins installed video cameras throughout the building where Hiram lived, including both staircases and elevators. If a woman leaves the apartment, he will see it. He hoped that she would come out to visit someone so that he could install wiretapping and video cameras inside the apartment. He installed them in her car last week and found nothing. He truly believed that Hiram was just another jealous husband who was spending his money, but he did his job. He couldn't imagine anyone wanting this old broad, but her husband acted like she was some kind of Brazilian supermodel. He was clearly delirious. Maybe this is what love becomes when you get old. He couldn't believe his luck when the old woman, looking even worse today, came out of the apartment. She was wearing one of those old-fashioned dresses and slippers. God, he didn't want to see what was underneath that dress. She clearly wasn't going far, so he had to be quick. It took him less than 15 minutes to hide and activate 20 video cameras inside the apartment and connect both his home phone and cell phone. He left before she returned, so he didn't need to come up with a cover story. Helen walked slowly and carefully down the back stairs of the building. No one ever used the stairs in the building unless all 3 sets of elevators were broken at the same time. In the 15 years of living in this building, this has never happened. Even then, most people would choose a well-lit front staircase over a dark back one. Helen was slowly walking down when a couple of floors below the stairs were blocked by 3 young men aged between 20 and 23 years old. They all grew up in this building. 2 of them, Tom and Henry, were the ones who appeared to be looking askance at her husband yesterday. The third, Aaron Moore, was their friend. Helen continued down the stairs to the landing below where the boys were. There was an old mattress in the corner. As she passed the boys, she heard Tom's voice. "I smell sex," he said. Helen walked past him as if she hadn't heard him. When she reached the last step, she stepped onto the mattress and lay down on it. The others joined in and had sex. She remembered the look of pain on Hiram's face and how he had humiliated Ted after what he saw yesterday. What would he think of that? If he ever saw it, there would never be any turning back. She started crying, remembering how lonely she felt last night. "I slept in the guest room just a few feet away." Those few feet could have been 20 miles because she couldn't reach out and touch him. The sound of his soft snoring 20-odd years ago was the subject of much debate. She was so used to it now that it had become comforting and reassuring, and she had found it difficult to sleep without it last night. "Don't cry because I'm leaving. I'll have sex with you again later," the guy said. "See you, Grandma," the guy said, climbing the stairs to join his friends. For a long time, Helen just lay on the dirty mattress on the floor and thought about what she had just done. The tears rolling down her cheeks were clear evidence of the guilt she finally felt. For the first time since she had first let the boys take over her, Helen felt regret. She suddenly realized that she still loved Hiram, and lying in the mud, she realized that it was quite possible that she could lose him. Yesterday she was unhappy because Hiram found out about Ted. Then she realized that Hiram would be angry, they would have a difficult time, but she really didn't think that he would throw away 20-odd years of happiness for a few kisses. But she realized that she never expected Hiram to find out about Ted, and he did. Therefore, she had no choice. She had to refuse the guys too, because for them she was nothing more than a sex toy. It was just sex. There was no point in jeopardizing her marriage for this. Today, for the first time, she realized that it really wasn't fun. It was just the idea that maybe if a bunch of young men wanted her, then she wasn't completely obsolete. She felt like she was young again, and they found her attractive. It was like 30 years ago when every man she dated, young or old, wanted to have sex with her. Aaron calling her an old dirty woman of easy virtue was a wake-up call for her. There were no illusions of love on either side. She and the guys just showed up for sex in any quantity or combination almost every weekday morning, but it gave her an idea of what they thought of her, and she didn't like it. She realized she had been a fool again. Did not have it sucks more fools than an old fool, but an old woman of easy virtue, especially an old dirty woman of easy virtue, was much worse. Helen stood up and began to look for her dress. Suddenly, a painful spasm went through her stomach, and she had to sit down again until the pain subsided. She put on her dress and slowly walked back up the stairs to her apartment. Clearly something was wrong with her. Maybe she would ask Hiram to check on her and find out what it was. Returning to her apartment, she felt a little better. She made herself a calming cup of tea and decided to take a nap. She put a warm towel on her stomach and lay down on the sofa, taking painkillers. She needed to come up with a plan to get her husband to forgive her. She was going to devote the rest of her life to making him the happiest man on the planet. Then she and Hiram could grow old together, as she had always dreamed of. To be honest, she wasn't bothered by the thought of getting old. She was worried about growing old alone. Helen never wanted to be alone. After a while, she felt better and decided to surprise Hiram by meeting him for lunch. The worst thing he could do is tell her he's busy or doesn't want to see her. But either way, he'll see that she's trying to make things work, and that must mean something. As Helen pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, she stopped and looked at an old woman, not much older than herself, who was wandering aimlessly down the street. She wasn't homeless or homeless, she just looked lost. The woman walked part of the way down the street and then turned around and went in the direction from which she had come. She tried to strike up a conversation with a few people on the street, but no one seemed to have time to talk to her. Finally, the woman simply sat down on a bench and began to look at the people passing by her. After a while, the woman spoke, but there was no one around her. Helen wondered in horror, could the same thing happen to me? She shook off the thought and drove to her husband's office. Hiram loves me too much to let me ever do something so bad, she thought. I really need to fix this. Helen walked slowly through the lobby, waiting room, and reception area. Hiram's nurses and assistants didn't even notice her as she walked by. She looked through the large glass panel into Hiram's office and saw him sitting at his desk. He already had lunch with this girl, Kelly. Helen always thought Kelly was in love with her husband from the moment she discovered boys. It seemed like she wasted no time trying to get to him once a tiny crack appeared in their marriage. Helen wasn't going to just back down and let the little bitch have him either. She burst straight into the office and cleared her throat loudly. I'm guessing you don't have room in your schedule to have lunch with your wife, do you? Helen said as warmly and friendly as she could. Hey, Kelly, you look good, she continued. I think you work too much. although the wrinkles appear on your face ahead of time. Perhaps you should relax more. We don't want you to look too old before you find yourself a man, Helen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Hi, Helen. I think I should take your advice, Kelly said, smiling. After all, you're an expert on how to look old and tired. But don't worry about me finding someone, because I think I already have, she said sweetly. I meant one of yours, Helen said through clenched teeth, her fake smile failing to hide her anger. Well, hypothetically speaking, if some really stupid bitch dumped her man for no good reason other than lack of common sense, Kelly began through equally clenched teeth. I don't see anything wrong with making it yours. Helen looked at Hiram, who said nothing, and then looked back at Kelly, who was still smiling. She turned and left, barely holding back the tears in her eyes. She screwed up even worse than she thought. Hiram was laughing so hard he could barely handle it. That was great, Kelly, he said. She really fell for your joke. I wasn't kidding, Kelly said seriously. As Helen drove home, she cried again. She had a hard time concentrating on the road and had to stop a couple of times to wipe her face so she could see. To begin with, Helen was never a very good driver. She was the stereotypical old lady in the far right lane with her turn signal always on. Today was no different, except that she drove even slower and more erratically because she was upset. Hiram has always been the driver in the family. He loved cars. Several times he thought about buying himself one of those little Italian sports cars, but with his characteristic practicality, he thought about it and decided otherwise. Why would I spend $200,000 on a car that we can't use to carry groceries home? The speed limit everywhere is 70 miles per hour, and when I want my brakes fixed, it will cost me another $5,000. Helen knew that deep down there was another reason. Hiram grew up in the 70s, when American muscle cars ruled the roads, and now it was starting to happen again. Despite gas prices and the politically correct greening of America, there were a growing number of people who wanted a 400 to 500 horsepower tire shredder, like the ones they thought were cool growing up. She was also shocked by the parallels happening in her life. She hid from Hiram that she was having sex with a whole group of young men in the building, whom they Karamam observed. Just this morning, she decided to end it because if Hiram found out, it would be the end of them. But now she finds out that little Kelly Cullum, whom she looked after as a child, was in fact vying for her husband. Although Hiram always seemed oblivious to it, Helen always knew that Kelly was in love with him. And now that Kelly was a woman in her 30s, and there was a certain weakness in the marriage, this little bitch jumped with both feet. Helen wasn't sure she could fight her back. If what she did came to light, it would definitely be over. Kelly was younger, prettier, and worked in the same profession as Hiram. In fact, Kelly worked in the pharmacy department of the same hospital where Hiram worked and referred his patients. Helen was sure that Kelly went into medicine because she had a childhood crush on Hiram. This intensified when she became young and asked Hiram to tutor her and help her with homework while in college. The girl often helped Hiram work on a series of Mustangs, which he owned for many years, and now she owns the same one. The worst part, of course, was that the girl's parents were going through their own marital problems, and to give them time to sort out their differences, Hiram allowed Kelly to move in with them. Helen was sure that it was completely innocent on Hiram's part. He saw her as another daughter, but Helen remembered having to talk to Kelly about how revealing the outfits she wore at home were. Helen herself wore some of Kelly's outfits for a while. Sometimes, when Kelly showed a little more skin than was appropriate, Hiram ended up having sex with Helen much more vigorously. In the end, Helen didn't complain about what the girl was wearing because Hiram didn't even think about touching the girl. Helen actually expected Kelly to be more supportive during this time, especially if she remembered that her parents had made peace and settled their differences. Then it became clear to Helen. Kelly didn't want them to get back together because she really wanted Hiram for herself. She was really supportive. She just wasn't supportive of both of them. The little girl whom Hiram had always considered his second daughter was trying to become his second wife. Speaking of daughters, why didn't Megan call me today? This thought made Helen forget about driving for a moment, and she braked sharply to avoid crashing into the car in front of her. This caused the guy behind her to slam on the brakes to avoid Helen, and there were almost a bunch of cars there. Helen's car stalled, and when she tried to start it, there was a line of people around her who shouted at her as they passed by. "Stupid old bitch, get a license," one guy said. "Old fool," shouted another. Many of them simply pointed fingers or made other rude gestures. Helen sat in the car again and cried. Her nerves were tense, and something was wrong with her body. She was on the verge of losing her husband because it turned out that she was not having an affair with Ted. Now she was afraid that her betrayal with the guys would someday come to light. She felt remorse, guilt, sadness, and anger at Kelly all at the same time. Add to that the fact that the thing that started it all, her vanity, was still there. That's what it all boiled down to. Helen had always been beautiful, and she thought of herself as a modern version of Helen of Troy. There were always men around her telling her how beautiful she was. She achieved success in real estate largely due to her beauty. Men always wanted to buy houses and buildings from her, hoping that they could seduce her. When Hiram appeared, this serious young doctor in his 20s, Helen had already begun to notice wrinkles on her face. She knew she had reached her peak, and it scared her. That's why she rejected the advice of her friends, who believed that Hiram was not on her level. He was learned, caring, and he truly helped people. When he looked at the building with her, he tried to see what could come of it, rather than imagining her naked. But eventually he found out, and from then on he worked tirelessly to make her happy. Hiram always talked about their future together. He said, "When we retire, we will do this, or we will live here. I think we should travel a little before settling down." He would say, "Helen, take some paper, let's make a list of places we want to go." She was his life this whole time, and she ruined everything. Hiram never boasted about anything because he didn't want his patients or people in general to think that he put himself above them. The two things he loved most he never mentioned. He just smiled when he saw them. It was always her and that damn car. Why didn't she think of this before? Hiram had two passions, and Helen had hers. While for Hiram it was his wife and his car, for Helen it was her vanity and fear of being alone. While Hiram's passions drove him to work hard to provide for her and afford the things he wanted for his car, Helen's passions drove her to seek praise, company, and comfort from other men. She just needed to know that men still found her attractive and desirable. Was it wrong? Another thing that bothered her were her old friends. All the women who advised her not to get involved with Kauramam disappeared when she became a wife and mother. They had nothing in common since she no longer went to clubs and bars. She went from being a party animal to being the center of one person's universe, and she knew she had made the right choice. In recent years, when they met again at the funeral of one of her old colleagues, Helen was in their place. They stood in their former glory, a bunch of almost toothless old women. Some of them were so bad that they seemed to be barely standing. This made Helen realize that leaving party life was a very good choice. The saddest thing, of course, was when a couple of them came up and started talking about its good. "Wow, Helen, you always knew how to choose," said Margin Blair, who was clearly drunk at the funeral. "Yeah, but what about that nerdy doctor she was so into?" Jessica Stevens added. "He was so skinny and bookish." "Not like this guy, va-va-va-voom. What happened to Herschel or Henry? What was his name?" continued Margin. "Did you break his heart, Helen?" "No," Helen answered simply. "His name was Hiram, and I married him. He is the one you old witches admire so much. It's amazing how some people change while others stay the same. Even then you were wrong about him. You were just a bunch of drunken, degenerate women of easy virtue who had opinions about everyone else without seeing your own shortcomings," Helen said, her voice as cold and fragile as ice. "And now, years later, he has gained confidence, but he is still the same kind and caring man I married. He has changed in your eyes, but he is still the same person," she said. "And you ladies have become much older and more experienced. You'd think you'd mature as you get older, but you're still a bunch of drunken, degenerate prostitutes. It seems the truth is that there is no fool worse than an old fool." Helen walked away smiling, but now, remembering those words, they came back to haunt her. Helen decided to sit in her car for a few more minutes and calm her nerves before getting back on the road, so the people she almost made crash into their cars would have already moved far away. She tried to call her daughter, but the call went to voicemail. She tried calling Megan's home phone, and after a few rings, her brother-in-law answered. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't call us for a while," he said before she could say hello. "Where is Megan?" Helen asked sharply. "Let me talk to my daughter." "She's here, Helen. I tried to be polite, but since you won't let me, she doesn't want to talk to you." Then he hung up. Helen was devastated. Her own daughter abandoned her. Megan had never been particularly close to her father, but now she was rejecting Helen. Her sister was angry at Helen. Her mother was not a factor, and now her daughter was abandoning her. And all this while Helen was on the verge of losing Hiram. All her fears of being alone became reality. Helen's heart rate jumped another notch. This couldn't happen to her. It was like a bad dream. Helen started the car and drove into traffic without checking the rear view, and neatly hit the car that was overtaking her. There was a sound crackling plastic and bending metal, but Helen continued to drive. She heard the other driver cursing and screaming, but she decided to ignore it. She needed to get home. Hiram had just finished seeing his last scheduled patient for the day. He sat at his desk and wrote bonus checks to his nurse, office manager, and medical assistant. He usually gives out bonuses at Thanksgiving and Christmas. The phone on his desk rang and Hiram looked at the screen and saw that the call was coming from one of the hospital's internal numbers. He didn't worry about it because he had several patients there, and there were also doctors he consulted with at the hospital, so receiving calls from there was common. He continued to write checks and held the phone between his ear and shoulder while talking. Hiram suddenly turned white as a sheet of paper, dropped the phone, and ran out of the office. Helen was taken to the hospital's emergency department by ambulance. All their problems faded into the background when he started the car. Using his Mustang's sync system, which synced with his cell phone, Hiram called Tammy. "Hiram, I don't want to discuss this yet," Tammy said. "I know I don't blame you for anything. You're just as much a victim as I am, but right now, despite what I said yesterday, I'm not sure Ted and I can survive this." "Tammy, Helen is in the hospital," Hiram said. "I'm going there now. I don't know any details, but she is your sister. No matter what happens to us or them, she is still your sister." Hiram repeated the call and almost had the same conversation with his daughter. The only difference was that his daughter asked why he even cared after what Helen did to him. He eventually asked Megan to come to the hospital as a favor to him. He didn't like that he asked her to come to the hospital as if it was a condition for him to continue helping her with her bills, but whatever it was, for her to come to the hospital. He was sure that if this was serious, Helen would want her daughter there. Hiram went to the front desk and learned that Helen had already left the emergency room and was in the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. He took the elevator to the 4th floor and met Dr. Dave Elliott as he exited the elevator. "I'm so sorry, Hiram," Dr. Elliott said, squeezing Hiram's hand. Hiram suddenly felt short of breath and felt as if the walls were closing in around him. This couldn't happen. He couldn't believe Helen died before they could fix their marriage. Dr. Elliott led his friend to the bench against the wall where Hiram had collapsed. "Come on, Hiram," Elliott said. "I know it's hard, but you really should have expected this. This is bad, but not unexpected under these circumstances. Maybe you should consider adoption. But that's a question for later. Now you need to be strong for Helen. She really needs you right now." Hiram looked at Elliott with a puzzled expression. "Dave, slow down," Hiram said. "From what you said, I thought you were saying that Helen died." "No, Hiram, Helen will be fine physically," Elliott began, "but it will have a serious emotional impact on her." Now she is confused and beside herself. Megan and Tammy ran up to Karamu and to Dr. Elliott at this moment. "Dad, how's Mom?" Megan asked. "She'll be fine physically," Hiram said. "Dave was just telling me the rest." Well, the worst part, of course, is that we did everything we could, but we couldn't save the child, Elliot began. He was too premature to survive. Hiram, I assumed that you knew that at her age, pregnancy itself was almost a miracle, but for you two to have sex so vigorously during pregnancy was unwise. Dave, what are you talking about? Hiram asked sharply. Hiram, the bruises from what you guys did this morning will heal in a few days. But our main concern is that she seems to have lost touch with reality. She thinks that you will blame her for the fact that the child did not survive. She kept begging us not to tell you, Dave said. As you know, patients who have gone through traumatic experiences sometimes lose touch with reality. She will need your care and support, he continued. Dave, I need a big favor, Hiram said. Anything, Hiram, Elliot replied. He saw that Hiram was very upset, but not in the way he expected. Hiram seemed on the verge of anger, rather than sadness, as would be normal. I need to do a DNA test on the fetus and check on that guy over there trying to stay hidden in the room, Hiram said, pointing at Ted. Both Megan and Tammy stood next to Karamam. No one said a word. Tammy turned to Ted with a look of disgust on her face. Megan simply hugged her father and looked at him. How long will it take to get the results of the first test? Hiram asked Dave. Well, Hiram, as you know, we will have to run the test several times to confirm the results, but I feel like you want to know the results of the first sample. Why don't you go and see her? Give me about an hour, and I'll prepare something for you, Elliot said as he walked towards the hall and Ted. Hiram, I never want to see that bitch again, Tammy fumed. Sister or not, if you and her weren't doing it. Well, you get the idea. And I'm sure she didn't sleep with Ted this morning, so how many men does she have? And whose child was she pregnant with? My sister is a fool, and an old fool at that. Tammy started to walk away and then turned to Kauramu. Hiram, I already told you that I'm seriously considering divorcing Ted. Both he and your wife swore to us that they never had sex. If this child turns out to be his, it will mean that they lied to us, on top of everything else. So if he's a father, tell him not to come home. Ever. Megan looked at her father too. Dad, what's wrong with Mom? Why is she doing this? I'm sorry, but I just don't want to see her right now. Perhaps never. Megan said, Dad, do you think Mom tried to sleep with my husband too? Hiram went to the nurse's station to find out which room Helen was in. He walked towards the ward, then straightened his face before entering. He walked over to the bed and looked at the woman he had lived with and loved for over 20 years. He didn't see much of her in the body on the bed. He reached over and wiped her forehead, as he would do with any other patient. She flinched at his touch and turned to face him. A new stream of tears began when she recognized him. She looked for signs of anger, pain, or judgment and found none. Don't worry, Helen, we have a lot to discuss, but first we need you to get better, Hiram said. They said, Helen whispered. We'll sort this out after you get better, Hiram said. For now, let's not worry about what happened, where we went wrong, who did what and why. We need to get you back on your feet first. Don't leave me, Hiram, Helen whispered. You are the best thing that has ever happened in my life. Please don't leave me. She yawned as she said this, and Hiram sat down on the chair next to her bed and held her hand until she fell asleep. As he was leaving the room, Kelly, who had heard that Hiram was in the hospital, approached him. She hugged him as tightly as she could and told him that no matter what, she would be there for him. Hiram and Kelly went down to the lab to get the results. Hiram was at Helen's bedside for more than the hour the lab needed, so the tests had already been run several times. The good news was that Ted was not the father. The bad news was that Hiram wasn't the father either. When he found out that Ted was not the father, Hiram told Ted to take a taxi home to his wife and never do that to her again. He and Kelly then left the hospital and drove home. When Hiram returned to the apartment, he opened the door and headed straight into the office. He turned on the computer and opened the disk on which video recordings from the cameras were saved. He checked the cameras in the apartment and in her car, but found nothing. He noticed that Helen had trouble driving, but that wasn't what he was looking for. There were several new recordings from cameras other than the living room, and he began checking them all. He found nothing again and again until he came to an entry labeled BS3. BS3 meant back staircase, third floor. Fortunately, the cameras recorded the movement, so there was no need to watch a blank recording. The video began with several young hooligans who always hung out on the stairs, pushing each other and smoking. Then Helen came into the picture. Hiram was shocked to see that she was doing things to them that he had never even thought about. Tears rolled down Hiram's cheeks as he paused the playback. Hiram didn't know what to think or what to do. He sat in the chair for a long time, not moving, not thinking, not seeing. Only the sound of the front door opening broke him out of his trance. "Hiram, what happened?" Kelly asked. She was really worried because she cared about him very much and had never seen him like this before. Over the past day and a half, Hiram has suffered blow after blow. His marriage, once the center of his life, has just suffered its latest attack. The bonds of love and trust that had been built over many years, through good times and bad, through happy moments and broken hearts, that he and Helen had built together over 25 years had been shattered in less than 25 hours. A plan began to form in Hiram's head. He turned to Kelly and said, "I might need a little help." "Whatever you need, I will do," Kelly replied. "I'll call you when I get back from the hospital," Hiram said. Hiram made several calls from his Mustang on the way back to the hospital. He transferred almost all of his regular patients to other doctors who could provide them with the care they needed because Hiram was planning to take a leave of absence. He had one patient who outweighed all the others. Hiram was sitting in a chair next to Helen when she woke up. She smiled when she noticed that he was still there. Hiram stayed with her all night until visiting hours ended, and he was told he had to leave. For the next few days, he was her constant companion. Even she was surprised to learn that he didn't go to the office or see his patients. "Hiram, your practice is your life," Helen said. "I don't expect you to pause it for me." "Helen, my practice is my job. You are my life," Hiram replied. Helen didn't notice that he said was. "Hiram, there are some really bad things we need to talk about," Helen said quietly. She felt even worse after hearing that she was his life. The remorse and regret she had felt since Thanksgiving intensified, and she realized that all this time he had always felt for her what she wanted. It was always there, she just didn't see it. In movies and television, men made grand romantic gestures, bought thousands of dollars in flowers, and went on trips around the world with their lovers. In real life, staying with someone and being faithful to them, perhaps forgetting the occasional anniversary or skipping a dinner or two, was just the norm. Staying with someone for over 20 years spoke of love much more realistically than any fairy tale romance. Why didn't she see this? In more than 20 years, as she grew fatter and older, her Hiram had never looked at another woman, although she was sure that several had tried to get his attention, including that damn Kelly Cullum, who was still waiting for him outside the door every damn day. Helen's biggest mistake was taking Hiram and his love for her for granted. She would never make that mistake again. Hiram had a habit of simply forgetting about the past and moving on. Every time Helen tried to think of a way to bring up what happened to her, he simply told her not to worry about it because they needed to cure her first. She came up with several plausible lies, such as that boys were blackmailing her into having sex with them. She thought she could get out of it if she had to, but Hiram didn't seem to know that. She had not heard from her sister or her daughter, although she had been told on the first day that they were here. Hiram also didn't mention the reason she was here. She honestly didn't believe it was possible to get pregnant at her age. At least her desire for sex was satisfied by the experience. She no longer just wanted sex, she now craved Hiram to make love to her in their bed, to prove to her that this experience was over and they could move on with their lives. She tried to call her sister, but got no answer. The phone just kept ringing. When she called back, Ted answered and hung up immediately upon hearing her voice. Fuck Ted, it was his fault as much as hers. If he wasn't willing to accept the consequences, he shouldn't have played this game. She tried to call her daughter the next day because she really wanted to talk to someone outside the hospital. At first, she thought she had dialed the wrong number, but after 3 tries, she was sure she had made a mistake. Her daughter's number was no longer in service. Megan probably missed too many bills, and the phone was switched off. She called Megan's cell phone with the same result. Helen was starting to get nervous because after 3 weeks in the hospital, she wanted to go home. She found out she was ready to be discharged a couple of weeks ago, but Hiram convinced them to keep her for another week. She wanted to go home and go to bed with her husband. She was confident that they could handle this. For the past few weeks, except for a few hours a day, they had been together. She loved it, and she loved Hiram. When no one else was there, he was there. He was the person she hurt the most, and yet he was there for her. If this isn't love, Helen didn't know what love was. Hiram waited in the building's lobby, nervous. Her phone rang, and she answered. "He's on his way. I'll chat with him for about 5 minutes. Be ready at the front stairs." Hiram walked up to the front stairs, waited a moment, and when he heard the sound of people coming down the steps, he threw a large plastic bag on the stairs and pretended to check his mail. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Tom coming down the stairs and spotting the bag. Hiram walked out the back door and up the back stairs to Kelly's floor. Tom lifted the bag and saw a large amount of medicine and ampoules inside. In addition to the obvious hospital drugs, there were several street illegal substances. What the hell was that old bastard doing with so much crap, he thought, going out into the street. Before he could complete his thought, 2 police cars pulled up, and the officers jumped out, pointing their guns at him. One of the officers snatched the bag from his hands and looked inside. "You'll be gone for a long time, bastard," the officer spat. Another police officer handcuffed Tom and put him in the back seat of the police car. Upstairs, Kelly hugged Hiram as they looked out the window. 2 days later, Aaron saw Kelly coming down the back stairs, just as Helen had done before. A lot of time had passed, and he missed this lecherous old woman. She allowed them to do whatever they wanted with her. What a crazy old bitch she was. But perhaps it was a new and better version, so he decided to follow it and find out. Wench bounded down the back stairs as if she owned them, and entered an apartment on the 2nd floor that was not hers. He looked inside before she closed the door and saw a plethora of electronics in the living room closet. Kelly lifted her skirt a little and then walked out, forgetting to lock the door. The door was still wide open. He followed her, wanting to know where she was going. She went up to the 4th floor and met this doctor, Helen's husband. She kissed the old fool and closed the door behind her. No wonder the old woman slept with him and his friends. Her husband had the hottest chick in the building, and the old wreck just felt out of place. Aaron wasn't stupid. Let them have as much sex as they wanted. He ran back to that 2nd floor apartment. The door was still open, and he noticed that it had been forced open. He entered and looked around. He was going to take the DVD player and maybe that little plasma TV with him. Oh my God, Aaron thought. On the table lay an absolutely beautiful Glock 9mm pistol. He picked it up. The clip was full of cartridges. He looked through the scope and whispered, "Groin." The guys will envy him. At least Henry for sure. This stupid Tom seems to have gotten caught on something. Just as he was thinking about what a fool Tom had been, he heard a loud voice say, "Drop your weapon, asshole." Aaron looked up, and there were 4 policemen with mentored pistols at him. When he was brought to the station, he was charged with trespassing, possession of an unregistered weapon, and all recent thefts in the building. He will go to prison for a long time. Some time ago, someone hit Henry in the back of the head and put him on a freight train headed out of state. When he woke up, he found $20 and a note in his pocket. The note said that if he ever showed up in the state again, what would happen to him would make the fate of his friends seem easy. Helen finally realized what the problem was. Something was wrong with her phone. At first, she thought her daughter had changed both of her numbers, and perhaps her sister had too. But when she tried to call Tom, Aaron, and Henry to tell them they couldn't see her anymore, and to ask them for a favor, she couldn't reach any of them. There must have been something wrong with her phone. It's impossible that all 5 of them changed their numbers or didn't pay their bills. She decided that one thing was stopping her from making her marriage work, and that was that little bitch Kelly. Her initial idea was to talk to Kelly and ask her to stay away from Hiram. She would remind Kelly that her own parents had been through a difficult time and got through it, so Helen and Hiram could too. All she needed was for Kelly to leave Hiram alone. If Kelly doesn't agree, Helen will have to turn to the boys. She was sure that Tom, Henry, and Aaron would be able to scare Kelly into leaving Hiram alone. She didn't want to do it, but if she had to, she would do it. Over the past few weeks, Helen has realized that she will never again let anyone or anything come between her and Hiram. She needed to talk to Kelly today because she was being discharged home tomorrow. She was discharged on Christmas Day. What a coincidence. After almost a month without sex, she knew what gift she would have for Hiram. He was so sweet yesterday, telling her he was preparing the house for her return for Christmas. He hinted that he had several gifts for her. Hiram was as predictable as the sunrise. He'll either give her a small, flat box from a jewelry store containing some sort of necklace or bracelet, or a large, flat envelope with tickets and instructions for the trip or cruise they're taking for Christmas. But Helen didn't complain. Even if he just wanted to sit down with her and discuss their problems, she was ready. The main thing is that they do it together. Everything else was acceptable to Helen. What Helen really wanted to talk about was to end this so they wouldn't have any secrets from each other. This way, he won't find out about it in 3 or 4 years and won't divorce her then. Right now, as long as he was concerned about her health and was in the mood for forgiveness, was the best time. Of course, she wouldn't tell him everything, but enough so that if it came up later, it wouldn't seem like she was lying. When the nurse came in, Helen asked Kelly from the pharmacy to come up to talk to her. Helen was surprised and even pleased to hear that Kelly had quit her job that morning. A picture began to take shape in Helen's head. Hiram probably explained to Kelly that he wanted to give their marriage another chance, and Kelly just lost her temper. Kelly was a fool if she thought he'd throw away 25 years for a couple of mistakes. Hiram arrived at dinner and told Helen that he had a patient to see, but that he would see her later or in the morning when they went home. He looked a little sad when he arrived, and Helen thought she knew why, but decided to inquire a little. "So are you going to ask Kelly to help you get the house ready for our Christmas party?" she asked. "I'm sure you don't want Ted there, but will Megan and Nick come? Will Tammy arrive without Ted?" She asked all the questions, although she was only concerned about one answer. "Helen, I haven't seen Kelly today. I think she has other things to do," Hiram said. "But we'll all get together for Christmas." A month has passed. It's time to leave all this behind and move forward with our lives. Helen tried to hide her grin and almost succeeded. Hiram kissed her goodbye, but it was an awkward kiss. Instead of kissing her on the lips, he kissed her on the forehead. Well, Helen thought, there will be a lot of kissing tomorrow. Hiram didn't show up at the hospital on Christmas morning. Helen was discharged at 9 a.m. and given instructions on what she should and should not do in the coming days. She noticed that nothing was said about sex, which meant she was free to attack Hiram as she had planned. Helen was told that Hiram had been detained again because of a patient. She didn't care, which meant everything was returning to normal, so she called a taxi to take her home. When she arrived at the building, Helen was filled with a feeling of joy and happiness as she watched the families coming in and out of the building. Christmas was the most special holiday, and she received the most wonderful gift, even though she didn't feel like she deserved it. She actually dodged a bullet. As for the boys, Hiram seemed to be completely in the dark. Maybe, when you look at all the good things she's done in her life, the universe has decided to let her have one mistake and let her keep the two things that mattered most to her: her husband and her marriage. She may have had to give up her relationship with her sister and perhaps even her daughter in exchange, but if she could choose the end of her story, this would be the ending she would choose. She might not even have to give up guys, but she would have to be much more careful. She took the elevator and decided at the last minute to try to talk to Kelly just in case. She stopped at the girl's apartment and discovered that the door was sealed with the same plastic film that was used for empty apartments. It looks like Kelly not only quit her job, but also moved. Oh well, she needed a fresh start. And even better for Helen. Helen used the key and opened her door, and was a little surprised. Hiram barely decorated the apartment. He didn't even put up their big artificial Christmas tree. He put up a pathetic one-year-old tabletop tree that had seen better days. Helen almost laughed because it was the ugliest, lonely little thing she had ever seen. It looked like the tree from a Charlie Brown Christmas. Hiram had strung one line of garland across the mantelpiece, and when she tried to turn it on, the lights sparkled and simply went out. The apartment seemed empty and cold. She walked into their bedroom and found what she expected, her gifts. 3 large boxes and a note. All this was neatly laid out on the made bed. Helen began to read the note. Dear Helen, I'm sorry I'm not with you, but I left you gifts. First open the large flat box marked 1, then read the next page of this note. Helen excitedly opened the box and found nothing in it except her hospital discharge papers and bills for her hospital stay and medical expenses. She didn't understand and thought it was one of Hiram's jokes. She read the next page of the note. Helen, now open the second box. Helen was sure it would be tickets or a brochure for a trip or cruise. She was wrong. The box contained many legal documents. She recognized one of them as a copy of the marriage contract that she had signed more than 20 years ago. She couldn't understand what was going on and needed glasses to read these documents, but suddenly she felt sick. She didn't read the note, but simply tore open the small box. There was no necklace or bracelet, but a DVD. She inserted it into the DVD player and pressed play. Helen almost choked when she saw herself on the screen with 3 guys. She had never seen herself on screen before, and it was nothing like how she felt. There was nothing romantic or sexual about it. She looked like some homeless old woman of easy virtue. She almost vomited as she watched, but luckily the scene changed. Hiram appeared on the screen, sitting in his chair in the office and looking straight at her. Oh my God, this man is so handsome. I'm so lucky that he married me, Helen thought. This is clearly his way of letting me know that he knows and forgives me. He fumbled, trying to look at the camera, and then said, Thank you, honey. What is he thanking her for? Helen heard another voice on the screen. It did not speak to her. Who the hell was her husband calling darling? Hiram on the screen looked directly into the camera and began to speak. Helen, Merry Christmas, Hiram said on the screen. Well, wait a minute, I didn't celebrate Thanksgiving with you. Okay, I was grateful for a lot of things at Thanksgiving, good and bad, Hiram said. I was grateful for the more than 20 years that I loved you more than anything in the world. I was also grateful that I finally found out what a cheating prostitute you turned out to be so I could move on with my life. Helen found it difficult to breathe. It felt like someone had hit her in the stomach. Helen, after Thanksgiving, I intended to work on repairing our marriage. I still loved you more than anything in the world, but I felt betrayed and hurt. I was sure we could work things out if you just stayed away from Ted. You played me like a fool, but I really wanted to live through it. But Helen, I deceived you too. You were a fool if you thought that after Ted I would trust you again. See, Kelly told me about her parents' reconciliation. We all thought they got back together, and they really tried, but it just didn't work. They were never the same again. Her mother spent years always worrying about where he was and who he was with. There was no trust left between them, just like with us. After all, she needed someone to rely on, and she too started an affair. He wanted to try again, but she just couldn't trust him and ended up marrying the man she had the affair with. Helen, I didn't trust you either, so I installed cameras in the apartment. I think you've seen the video, so you know we have no hope. I filed for divorce and found someone new. According to our prenuptial agreement, in the event of divorce, you are entitled to 20% of my current net worth. I left you $200,000 in our former joint account, which is now in your sole possession. All credit cards that were in our names have been canceled. You will have to apply for new ones. Helen, you might as well leave our luxury apartment because the thought of staying in this building makes me sick. I know there were a lot of good memories there, but I will create new ones. Helen, please save your money. Your long hospital stay was not covered by our insurance, so you will be billed for the last 3 weeks of your month there. The medical expenses themselves will be about $35,000. Besides, a private detective came here looking for you. He wanted to know where you were because you seemed to have fled the scene of the crime. Helen watched in horror as Kelly walked over to the table and sat on Hiram's lap. She lifted her head and kissed Hiram, then smiled at the camera. They both waved goodbye. The screen went dark. Helen sat on the bed, thinking that she was a fool. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Helen thought it was her daughter or sister, but it turned out that it was two policemen. They arrested her for a hit-and-run accident a month ago. She was charged with careless driving and leaving the scene of a crime. Helen spent Christmas in prison. She used her bell to call Tammy, forgetting that her sister had changed her number and she didn't know the new one. Helen had no choice. She called Hiram and thought that he would not pick up, but he did. "Hiram, please, I need your help. I'm in prison," she began. "Hi, Helen," Kelly said. "We're at Tammy's house with Megan and Nick. Your grandson is so cute. I think Hiram and I will have the same one. He better hurry up to get me pregnant because I'm already in my 30s. Well, it was nice talking, Helen. I'll tell Hiram that you called to wish us a Merry Christmas. He's outside talking to Ted. I think they can be friends again. After all, there was only one stupid old thing they were fighting about, and neither of them wants you." With these words, Kelly hung up. Helen thought, "I was a fool, and now I've lost everything. Kelly has taken over my husband, my sister hates me, my daughter hates me. Even the boys abandoned me. I was a fool, and there is no fool worse than an old fool." Several days passed. Hiram felt empty, but he couldn't afford to be weak. He saw how Kelly cared for him and supported him, and it gave him the strength to continue. He decided that he needed to move forward, despite everything that had happened. "Kelly stayed by my side, Koera Mom. She really cared about him and wanted to help him cope with this situation." They began to spend more time together, and Hiram began to see her not only as a young colleague, but also as a woman who was willing to be there for him in times of need. Several months passed, and Hiram decided to start a new life. He sold his share of the clinic and moved to another city with Kelly. They decided to start over with a clean slate and leave the past behind. Meanwhile, Helen was convicted of her crimes and given a suspended sentence. She returned to her apartment, but everything there reminded her of her lost life. She tried to improve relations with her daughter and sister, but they wanted nothing to do with her. Helen realized that her mistakes had led to complete isolation. She often sat in her apartment, reminiscing about the past and thinking about how things could have been different if she had made different choices. Helen tried to find solace in religion, attending church and praying for forgiveness. But pain and regret did not leave her. Years have passed. Helen was left alone, but she learned to live with it. She realized that her mistakes had become her punishment and that she could only move on, trying to correct at least something in her life. She started working at a homeless shelter, helping those in difficult situations, and this gave her at least some sense of usefulness. Hiram and Kelly got married and had children. They were happy together and rebuilding their lives. Hiram will always remember his past, but he has learned to live in the present and appreciate what he has. Helen's story became a lesson for him. He realized that one cannot take love and loyalty for granted. He learned to appreciate every moment of his life and love those who were near him. And Helen, although she was left alone, found her solace in helping others. She realized that her mistakes led to the destruction of her life, but she was able to find the strength to continue living and help those who needed help. She hoped that one day she would be forgiven by those she betrayed and that her life would still have meaning. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.